G'day folks, it's Will here from Flow Mountain Bike and welcome to this video review of the 2021 Orbea Oiz. This here next to me is the Orbea Oiz, or the Oiz if you're from the Basque region of Spain. I'm not, so I'm going to be calling it the Oiz in this video review. Now the Oiz is Orbea's 100mm travel, full suspension, go fast XC race bike. It's been updated for 2021 with a brand new carbon fiber frame, which makes this one of the lightest full suspension mountain bikes on the market. I've been testing this bike for the past 6 weeks and you can now read the full review over at flowmountainbike.com. We've put a link into the video description below. Click that and that will take you through to the full review of this bike right here. In this video, I'll be talking about the OMX carbon frame and some of the features that make the Oiz stand out from the rest. More importantly though, I'm going to be talking about how this bike actually rides on the trail and how it compares to some of the other XC bikes we've tested lately, like the Canyon Lux, the Cannondale Scalpel, and the Specialized Epic. So the current Oiz platform was introduced in 2018. However, it has been updated for 2021 with a very special type of carbon fiber that Orbea calls OMX. Now this carbon fiber has helped this frame to drop 250 grams over its predecessor. Orbea claims the Oiz OMX frame weighs just 1,740 grams including the rear shock, and that is very lightweight for a full suspension frame. The Oiz OMX frame also has a brand new swing arm which is lighter and sleeker than before. It moves to a flat mount disc brake caliper which, aside from looking really clean, according to Orbea it also allows the seat stay to flex closer to the rear axle, which improves suspension performance. We've also now got a SRAM universal derailleur hanger, which is nice to see, and the chainstay length is actually 5mm shorter than before. Rear center length on this bike is just 430mm, which is quite short. Speaking of geometry, the Orbea Oiz has a 69-degree head angle up front, a steep 75-degree effective seat tube angle, and on the medium frame size that I've been testing here, a 435mm reach. That's matched to a 75mm long stem and 760mm wide flat bars. Now for 2021, Orbea has 10 models in the Oiz lineup. Most of those bikes have a 100mm travel front and rear, but there's also a 120mm travel version called the Oiz TR. The range kicks off with the Oiz H30, which sells for 4,299 Australian dollars and goes all the way up to $12,999 for the Oiz M Limited. The bike that I've been testing here is the Oiz M Team. This is one step down from the top of the range and it sells for 10,999 Australian dollars. Now it's built around the new Oiz OMX carbon fiber frame and it features a full Shimano XTR group set, DT Swiss XRC 1501 carbon wheels, 2.35-inch Maxxis Recon race tyres, and Orbea finishing kit all round, including the very neat OC stem that integrates nicely with the headset spacers and top cap. Confirmed weight for our test bike, as you see it here without pedals and setup tubeless, is 9.86 kilograms. Now in terms of setup, I stand at 175 centimeters tall and I've been riding a medium in the Orbea Oiz. As for rear shock setup, Orbea recommends running between 15 to 20% sag, which isn't very much. And because it's quite a small 40mm stroke shock, I'd recommend getting the ruler out to help you measure sag during setup. For my 68 kilo riding weight, I put 165 PSI inside the rear shock, and I also followed Orbea's recommendations for rebound damping, which was quite fast, just 3 clicks off the fastest setting. Up front is a Fox 32 step cast, which is a brilliant fork. I've tested this fork many times before on other bikes, and I set it up exactly the same, which is very close to what the guide recommends on the back of the fork leg. Now speaking of suspension, one of the standout attributes of the Orbea Oiz is the Squidlock. The Squidlock is designed by Orbea and it gives you remote control of both the fork and the rear shock. It isn't just a remote lockout though, this is a 3-position adjuster. It's not unlike the Scott twin lock system, but I will have to say that the Squidlock is more ergonomic in its shape with larger paddles, and it also provides better functionality on the trail. The Squidlock offers 3 different settings. You've got open, medium, and firm. In the open position, both the fork and the rear shock are completely open. In the firm position, both the fork and the shock are locked out. In the medium position, the rear shock compression damping is increased, but the fork remains open. And this is where it differs to the Scott twin lock system, where in their medium setting, both the rear shock and the fork are firmed up. Here, it's only the rear shock. Now, what that does is it provides effectively an on-the-fly geometry adjustment. With the compression damping on the rear shock firmed up, you get a stronger platform that helps to lift it higher in its travel, but the fork is allowed to sag naturally into its travel. And what that does is it steepens the effective angles on this bike, giving you a better climbing position. It took a little while to get used to the Squidlock because it uses a push to unlock system. So in its resting state, the fork and shock are locked out. You have to push that big paddle to reach the medium and open positions. Once I got used to it though, I started using it on the trail all the time. That medium position in particular provides you with a really powerful and efficient climbing position. It's great for technical climbs because if you're riding up a trail where you've got rocks and roots, the fork is still able to absorb those impacts because it's completely open. It's also really good for motoring along rough fire roads where you still want comfort at the grips, but you don't necessarily need all the suspension travel at the back. And once you transition onto smoother terrain, whether that's on the road or on a smooth single track climb, you can flick that paddle back into the firm position and you've got a firm lockout front and rear when you need it. Now, the real beauty about the Squidlock design is because the remote is so functional and that medium setting is so effective for climbing, you can really optimize the rear shock setup for descending performance. Partway through testing, I actually decreased the shock pressure. I dropped from 165 to 155 psi, and that increased rear shock sag up to 25%. I also slowed the rebound damping a few clicks to halfway. And because the swing arm has a certain amount of flex in it as the suspension goes through the travel, the back end of this bike can feel a little bit springy out of the box, and I found a slower rebound setting helped to kind of calm that down a little bit. Once I'd lowered the pressure and slowed the rebound down, the back of this bike is actually really smooth. It's really quite an active suspension design. It gives really good traction, smooth, comfortable feel, and quite a lot of control on rough trails. Despite the falling leverage rate at the end of the travel, this is quite a small volume rear shock, so it inherently has more ramp up towards the end of the travel. The shock air can does come with a 0.2 volume spacer inside. You do have the option to remove that spacer if you want a more linear suspension feel, or you can add a 0.4 spacer to give you a little bit more ramp up towards the end of the travel. Personally, I found the shock tune to be spot on with this bike. Thanks to the active suspension, the handling of this bike is actually really good on the descents. It's not the slackest bike with that 69-degree head angle, but the effective suspension keeps it quite steady on the descents with good traction when things get rough. Also, I have to say the 44mm fork offset is one of the best things that's happened to the modern XC bike. That shorter offset really helps to steady the front end when you're riding at high speeds. This bike is still sharp and direct, but there's less of that kind of oversteer and wiggle that you get from bikes with longer offsets or sharper head angles. The wide bars help to give you good leverage and control over the front wheel, and there's plenty of traction out of those 2.35-inch tires, which are well supported by the 30mm wide DT Swiss rims. Now, I've got to say, this is an excellent wheel set choice for this bike. These are really nicely damped while still being quite whippy and responsive. And given they've got wide rims, they're quite light, 1,581 grams for the pair. Also helping with stability on the descents is the low bottom bracket height. The BB on this bike sits 47mm below the hub axle line, which is quite low for an XC race bike. It does bring your center of gravity closer to the ground, and it gives you a really in-the-bike feel through the corners. Despite the low bottom bracket though, I never actually clip my pedals all that much on this bike. There's quite a bit of anti-squat in the suspension design, so when you do step on the pedals, it's got a really snappy feel under power. It also means the shock extends slightly and kind of lifts the bottom bracket a little bit further off the ground. Furthermore, on technical climbs, I was always in the medium suspension mode, and that meant that the back of the bike was already higher off the ground, keeping my pedals further away from rocks and roots on the trail. Now, while the Squidlock is excellent, it does add 2 more cables to the front end of this bike, which might bother some riders. Personally, I think it's more than worth it, and the cables are otherwise really well managed elsewhere on this frame. During testing, I did have to rebuild the lower headset bearing, which I initially suspected was due to poor sealing around the headset top cap. I later found out though that it was due to washing this bike upside down in my backyard. There's quite a large opening above the upper shock mount, and it means that if the bike is upside down, There's a big opening there for water, mud and dirt to get inside the frame. While I would recommend not washing this bike upside down, or if you do have a really wet and muddy ride, making sure that any residue water has had a chance to drain out of the frame, I would like to see Orbea provide more sealing around that upper shock mount to help keep water and dirt out of the frame to begin with. Otherwise, I have to say this is a really well finished frame. It looks absolutely fantastic and there's nothing too proprietary about it either. I love the dual bottle compatibility, worth noting that the small frame will only take one bottle, but the medium, large and extra large frames will take 2 bottles inside the main frame. That's fantastic for long distance cross-country racing, marathon racing, and also just long distance trail riding, which I've been doing a lot of on this test bike. There's also a really nice minimalist chain guide here, which was completely silent and rub-free throughout testing. And of course, the XTR drivetrain was absolutely flawless as well. I've got to give a shout out for the XTR race brakes. These are the lighter 2-piston XTR brakes. Very smooth, huge amounts of modulation, and plenty of power in this stock configuration with the 180mm rotor on the front and the 160mm rotor on the rear. One thing to note for heavier riders though is 160 is the biggest size you can go on the back of this bike, so that's something to take into consideration. So how does the Orbea Oiz compare to some of the other XC bikes we've tested? Well, the Canyon Lux is another really well-rounded XC bike that shares a similar aesthetic to the Oiz. But while the Lux is a little sharper in its handling and perhaps a touch more efficient in its pedaling, the Oiz is pretty much a better bike in every other way. It's lighter, it's more streamlined, and the Squidlock is much more functional and more ergonomic than the Lux's remote lockout. The suspension is more active, and overall the Oiz is more planted on the descents. I do really like the IPU headset on the Canyon Lux, as the Oiz doesn't come with the steering limiter at all. And Canyon does provide pretty good value for money, given it's a brand that sells direct to consumer online. As for the Cannondale Scalpel, well, that is one of the most progressive XC bikes currently on the market, certainly in terms of its suspension and its crazy lefty ocho fork, which is an excellent performer. The suspension is more seamless on the Scalpel compared to the Oiz, but it isn't quite as efficient, and it also has a much simpler 2-position lockout system. While the lefty ocho is a fantastic performer, the longer offset does mean that the steering is a little bit wigglier on the descents compared to the Oiz. It also requires a proprietary front hub and a proprietary crankset, which might put some riders off. The Specialized Epic is probably the easiest bike to compare because its brain-equipped suspension makes it such a distinctive ride on the trail. The cockpit on the Epic is super clean compared to the Oiz, and you don't have to flick any suspension remotes. The brain damper basically takes care of that for you. When you're on your A game, it does work beautifully, but when you're not, it can be quite a harsh and unrelenting bike to ride. In comparison, the Oiz is a smoother and more comfortable bike overall, particularly on technical climbs where you can leave that fork open in the medium suspension setting. And that neatly brings us to the verdict of the 2021 Orbea Oiz. And I'm going to say it straight up. This is the best cross-country bike I've ever tested. It looks great, it's lightweight, it's efficient, and it pretty much comes with every feature that an XC racer could want. But it's really the Squidlock remote on this bike that separates it from the rest. It delivers on-the-fly adaptability that gives you a really powerful and efficient climbing position without having to compromise suspension setup for the descents. It is a terrific system, and it really enhances the handling and suspension quality of this bike. Now, if you'd like to read the full review of the 2021 Orbea Oiz, make sure you click that link in the video description below. That will take you to flowmountainbike.com to read the full review on this bike here, which has a load more detail about my experience of testing this bike. If you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed already to our YouTube channel, make sure you do that now, because we've got plenty more video reviews coming your way soon. All right, that's it from me, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Tooroo!